But comfort woman is a euphemism for mostly girl children under 15. And it was a system of sex slavery that was masterminded by the Japanese government and military to prevent the Japanese soldiers from raping the local women and girls. Because if the army and the navy would rape the local people, the local women, then it would be harder to suppress and control them. And also there was the risk of sharing or passing on sensitive information, like through espionage. And so initially they sent Japanese women, and this system started in 1932, and the first comfort stations were in northern China. And the first batches of women were Japanese, but they were in their 30s, and most of them had STDs, and the soldiers contracted these VDs and were unable to fight. And so that's why they went younger and younger, using brokers and middlemen in the colonized countries. And because Korea and Taiwan were colonized before the war, most of the women early on in the war were from these two countries. And then later it expanded as the Japanese military spread out and conquered different territories, like even Hong Kong has several comfort stations that we discovered, and it shocks Hong Kong people. You know, there two at schools, and so in Hong Kong they spread to Singapore, Burma, Malaysia, Taiwan. You know, you name it, East Timor. There were Australian nurses who were comfort women in Hong Kong, Dutch women who were prisoners of war in Indonesia, because the Dutch had colonized Indonesia before the war began. But about that film, sorry, I forgot to mention that I've lived and worked in mainland China for about 8 years, and have lived in Hong Kong with my husband for over 5 years. And the film, it touches people. It touches the Chinese. This is my first time showing a big group of Korean people. I think there's a lot of Korean people, but I've mostly campaigned to Chinese people, and they have been touched. And it's the act of this grassroots team that almost dislodges the bitterness and gives them the space to even think about releasing that kind of generational bitterness and hatred towards the Japanese. I want to read out, because we're in the great city of Martin Luther King. Darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that. And this Japanese team, you know, at the risk of their own reputation in Japan, because activists who talk about comfort women and rape of Nanking, they're so persecuted. And Dr. Yoshimi Yoshiaki, who wrote a seminal book on comfort women, he's received several death threats. Takashi Yumera, the first journalist to write about comfort women in 1991, he received so many death threats, and now he's teaching in South Korea at a university, trying to bridge the two countries, because the university that was about to fire him caved into right-wing pressure. And right-wingers believe these women were not forced, but that they were voluntary, well-paid prostitutes. So Kim Sun-duk, I met her in 2001 in Washington, D.C. She was filing an international lawsuit under the Alien Tort Claims Act, which allows countries to sue other countries from the United States. And because of their lawsuits in Japan were exhausted and didn't go anywhere, even though the judges recognized that these women suffered as sex slaves, but they said because of the statutes of limitations, you know, it's over 20 years, the judge cannot do anything. And so as a last-ditch effort, these women have gone through various routes, the ILO, the EU, Canada, the United States, different lawsuits, and Kim Sun-duk was a plaintiff in that lawsuit that she launched in DC and spoke at a press conference. And she was a teenager when she was deceived. She was promised a job as a nurse And she waited until her cousin passed away, or actually her partner passed away, and her cousin didn't want her to go forward because she felt like, wow, why would you do that? It's so shameful. But she went ahead and she spoke about what happened to her because she was compelled to tell the truth. And there were up to 200,000 victims. There's a Chinese scholar who believes that there were 200,000 Chinese victims alone. But I stick with the up to 200. It could vary between 80,000 to 200,000. And if these victims stood shoulder to shoulder, it would be from Johnson City to Nashville. That's how many victims there were. And they were all over the Japanese Empire, over 1,000 rape stations or comfort stations. And the euphemism comfort woman was because they were to comfort the Japanese soldiers and help them perform better on the battlefield. Over 1,000 in China alone. Isn't that mind-boggling? And all over the Japanese Empire. One survivor, Lee Yong-soo, she was in a conversation in Taiwan that was bombed. So these women are right on the front lines with bullets and bombs going off. They were almost forgotten, and many of you already know this. Due to shame, the women, even in the U.S., it's still taboo to talk about rape or sexual slavery or trafficking. And Kim Hak-soon in 1991, she stepped up. That was over about 50 years later, after the war ended. And she decided to go against the grain because she saw a news report that said the Japanese government called the comfort woman voluntary prostitutes. And that so outraged her that she decided to speak to the international media. And that was my connection to this story, because my mother read a newspaper article in the Korean newspaper in Vancouver, and she told me about comfort women. And that just, it blew my mind. In China, the victims are even coming out last year. And for reasons, because of the Cultural Revolution, the famine, you name it, the political instability, it wasn't until the last few years that the central government has really come forward in support of this issue, and they've even made a really big museum devoted to this topic, and I'll talk about that later. Wan Aihua, she was the first Chinese survivor to speak out and join a lawsuit. She was raped up to 5 times a day, captured 3 times actually, and she kept fainting when she was telling us her story in Shanghai. And she had to travel from Shanxi all the way to Shanghai, which took several hours. She was 82, 83 when we interviewed her. And I was really struck by how traumatized she was, even, how many years, over 60 years after her ordeal. Ellen van der Ploeg she has an Indonesian mother, a Dutch father. She was a prisoner of war, and she was plucked out of the POW camp, which is against the international laws. And she was 17, 18. She just finished high school, and she was forced into the comfort station. And she was very silent about this issue until another Dutch survivor named Jan Ruff O'Hearn, who was inspired by Kim Hak-soon in 1991. And Jan Ruff O'Hearn decided to go forward, and that inspired many other Dutch women to also testify. And Ellen sadly died in 2013, but her testimony was very instrumental in the EU, in Canada, in the US, especially in the US with the motion, the bill that Mike Honda was responsible for bringing forward, calling on the Japanese government to apologize and to take legal and moral responsibility. But she never lived a normal life, was never able to marry, was full of hurt and bitterness. It was really sad to see. Huang Gongju, I interviewed her a few times in 2002 and then 2004. She lost control of her bowels because she was raped by up to 30, 40, sometimes 50 men a day. She was sterilized with an injection called 606 that made her infertile. She was never able to have kids. She was promised a job, working in a factory. She is from North Korea, but at that time there was no division. But there are many North Korean victims and survivors, and North Korea is quite supportive of this issue. It's actually one of the only issues that North and South really agree on. And my friends have gone to North Korea, and there's anti-Japanese slogans everywhere in Pyongyang. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but Huang Gongju, it really is a North Korean who walked. It took her 2.5 months to walk home from China. She was forced into sex slavery in China. Took her months to walk home. She was never able to marry. She was a peddler on the streets, really barely eking out a living, and then later she was able to start a little tiny restaurant, making guksu, like soups and things like that for people. And her adopted children, she adopted some children, and I think that's what enabled her to survive, because she had a reason to live. She had to help, the Korean War orphans and take care of them. And they later said that, to another NGO person who told me, they said that their mom has so much anger, so much hatred, and it's hard to be close to her, So it's just really sad, the impact. Wang Nai Nai, she's the one on the left. We call her the happy grandma. She became brighter after the Japanese team apologized. She was the one who wept when the Pastor Fujie said sorry. And Pastor Fujie was the first Japanese man that many of the Chinese survivors had seen since they were raped. And so it was very powerful, very healing for her. She was 14 years old when she was raped repeatedly, sometimes overnight. She was captured in her village. The men that she was captured with, several of them were just killed. Her and the other girls, I'm assuming they were as young as her. They were kept, and then when she was no longer useful, they threw her out on the streets and left her for dead. And then by divine coincidence, someone found her and dragged her to her family's home. But Wang, she is simple, but when we interviewed her, she said, yes, she wants an apology. It's not about the money for her. So before these women were, just regular people, I often wonder, wow, what if it had been me? That's when I was 15 and my mother told me about Kim Hak-soon. I kept thinking that. What if it had been me? I'm the same age as Kim Hak-soon when she was first taken to North China. And, the woman on the left is Chen from Taiwan. And she suffered tremendously, raped by multiple men a day. But the sad thing was when she adopted children, and when she came out with her story, her children, abused her verbally and were ashamed of her. And she didn't allow me to use her real name until the last few years. I saw her in the newspaper clippings advocating in Taiwan for an apology from Japan. And I saw, wow, she used her real name. And so maybe her children came around. And there was another Filipina victim, survivor that I interviewed, and the same thing, her children despised her, for going through that. So it's mind-boggling why the reaction is that way. And Jan Ruff O'Hearn, I mentioned her, she's the one on the right, Indonesian mother, Dutch father. She was 19 and she was raped, dozens of times a day, night. She even cut her hair to make herself, unattractive, but that caused the soldiers to even, become more curious. One of the most traumatic things she said was a doctor that came to the comfort station to check on the women to make sure they were okay. and this was part of the whole like meticulous organizing of the Japanese government and military. The military doctor would check her and then he would rape her. And that created a fear of medical doctors even in her old age. And she was never able to have a normal marriage, even though she was able to have 2 daughters who have vowed to keep fighting for an apology after their mother passes away. But the impact is lifelong, lifelong. And if they lose their dignity, some of the women I've interviewed were raped by up to 50 men a day. And that's why the Japanese soldiers refer to them as chosun-pi, which means toilet, public toilet. So these women were in stalls, and it was like a reproductive or a production line, where and some of the men, the soldiers lined up so long, and the women didn't have time to eat. And Professor Yun, who is one of the first to bring up this issue in Korea, she told me that some of the women had to eat bread and then they were still being raped. They had no time to eat. It was that cruel. And years later, it costs the women everything. She has nothing. No shred of dignity, so much shame, not able to marry, and this is at a time when you had to marry. If you're not married, you're not a person, right? In China, it is that way, isn't it? It cost her everything. She lost everything. And this is what I really want to drive home every time I speak, and I'm hoping the people of Atlanta will know. These women are not seeking money, they're not seeking fame, they're seeking recognition, they're seeking an apology, they're seeking peace, and that it would never happen again. Several of them have said to me, I don't want women and girls to be raped in war. And so they've linked it to the issue of banning rape as a weapon of war and sexual violence. And this is the longest running activist movement in the world. Sadly, because there has been no closure and no justice. Why else is this problem important, or this issue important? It was government run. Yoshimi Yoshiaki found 529 documents, most of them from the Department of Defense, that links directly to the military and government. 529 documents. And he found it very simply, actually. Yoshimi Yoshiaki, before the 500 documents, he found, the smoking gun. And he was able to go forward with it. And he's one of my heroes. Despite the death threats, he stands for the truth. And he's a soft-spoken, gentle, very kind man, who doesn't seem to be afraid. And why is this still, cropping up? Many people have said, well, the Japanese government have apologized many times. Government officials have issued apology. There's the Kono statement from 1993. Yes, and even in the Comfort Women Japan-Korea Accord, there was a sincere apology. Abe said sincere apology, but they backtrack, and Abe is here with a Shinto priest and heading to Yasukuni. And, so many officials, even after the apology, and then we hear news of they're going to Yasukuni again, the prime minister, or they've approved right-wing history textbooks that minimize comfort women, minimize rape of Nanking, minimize Japanese aggression in Asia before and during World War II. And so that's the heart of it, really, right? That if the apology is not sincere and not touching people like this, German Chancellor Willy Brandt knelt spontaneously at a Holocaust memorial in 1970 in Poland, and he said, "We are sorry, we're sorry," with tears in his eyes. And the Holocaust survivors and their children said his apology brought healing and release. And that's what we dream of, right? What if Prime Minister Abe knelt on the ground, in front of the survivors and said, "We are sorry," and then he would stop going to Yasukuni Shrine, which is like a shrine to Hitler, the German equivalent. It's like a shrine to Hitler, because in Yasukuni Shrine, there are several Class A war criminals who are worshipped there. They're worshipped, and they were never brought to justice. There are Nazi hunters, and they will grab 90-something-year-old elderly men, and they'll throw them in prison, right? To satisfy the Holocaust survivors' demand for justice and their descendants. No such thing for the Japanese. No such thing. And Abe, on his mother's side, his grandfather was put in prison at one time for being a suspected Class A war criminal. And many of the military people who were involved in Comfort Women, including Nakasone, Prime Minister Nakasone, who wrote in his biography of how proud he was for building a comfort station. He said it was a beautiful building, and they're perpetuating the right-wing mindset. Why should we care? 4 reasons. The hatred continues, the wounds have never healed. I've witnessed at least 3 or 4 riots, very violent riots in mainland China, and where cars were overturned, where windows were smashed, where anyone looking Japanese was a target, and I was afraid for the Japanese reporters, and the hatred goes so deep, in part because they learn about Japanese war crimes and comfort women from a young age. The Japanese in Japan, they don't learn anything, right? My siblings and my sister-in-law. We didn't learn in history, in our Eurocentric history books about comfort women. And so that's why when my mom told me in 1991, when I was 15, turning 16, I was so floored, I was shocked. And it led me to search for more of this information in the history books. And I went to the library, searched every index of the books on World War II, nothing. And I thought, how can that be? Isn't that so strange? Like, it happened, but why isn't it not in my textbooks? I didn't understand, Eurocentric or Japan-centric textbooks at the time. And that, but when I started researching this, I realized, wow, it touches me, as a Korean person, but as a woman. And, when I interviewed the former UN Special Rapporteur, Gay McDougall, in 1999, she's a well-known human rights lawyer, and as a special rapporteur at the UN, she wrote the second report, very long report, on the Japanese military sex slavery system. And these are very clear, hard-hitting reports. And Rita Kumaraswamy, she wrote the first one. And Gay McDougall told me over the phone that the Japanese spent a lot of money trying to bury her report at the United Nations. And that shocked me. And I realized as a junior reporter that I had stumbled on a story that was so important, too important for me to let go. And then I wrote an op-ed in 2001, and then I found out through my friend or my colleague, who was considered one of the best investigative reporters in the city, and he received a call from another journalist who was hired by the Japanese consulate in Vancouver to find out information about who I was, because I was beginning to write about this issue and bring shame, I guess. And that made me realize, wow. And that's why I wrote my book under a pen name, to protect myself from right-wing persecution. So this is an 80-year-old man burning himself in Seoul, Korea, because of the Japanese going to Yasukuni. And these former survivors in Seoul are still fighting over 70 years every Wednesday. I think it's now closer to 2,000 demonstrations since the mid-90s or late 90s. They've been demonstrating in front of the Japanese embassy, and that's where the statue is as well. I mean, it's such a well-known spot. Tourists go there all the time. Japanese tourists go there regularly. You know, that's how well-known it is. And it's quite a beautiful statue and really a monument to peace, in my view. So their quest for justice, this is Kim Soon-dok in DC when I first met her. The woman on the right is someone from Korean Youth United. So it's galvanized the Asian American community politically, this issue. I'm just shocked that in 2017 we're still dealing with this. And this press conference was in 2001. I would rather not be talking about this right now and advocating for an apology. In 2017. History is repeating itself. ISIS and Boko Haram, it's really a continuation of the Japanese military sex slavery system, and where they're really, passing these women around, selling them, and like many of the comfort women survivors were sold by either family members or brokers. We need to stop this cycle, and. If Korea, China, Japan, and the other nations cannot agree on this issue, comfort women, Japanese military sex slavery, how can they cooperate to end modern day sex trafficking? There are 4.5 million girls and women who are being trafficked. And one NGO said, and I couldn't confirm it before this talk, that the highest number of foreign women being trafficked into the United States is Korean women. And I will try to confirm that, and we do need to heal old wounds. We need to heal these deep generational wounds, like the TRC, although it wasn't a perfect model, but at least some of the issues, some of the hatred and the crimes were brought out into the open. And perhaps we also need to address slavery in the U.S. There was never reconciliation. There was emancipation, but not really reconciliation. And what else is being done to help? You saw the movie, the grassroots reconciliation effort. That's what some of us believe, that perhaps a grassroots movement in Japan may be one way for the Japanese government to bring closure for the women. These women's faces before the apology were, haunted. It was dark. It was, they were anguished, but their faces brightened because they received recognition in a substitutional kind of way. And it could never replace an official government apology, of course. But look how bright her face is after she received, a sorry that really meant something, that touched their hearts. And my film and book are in the New Nanjing Comfort Women Museum. The government officials were so touched by the Japanese team that they felt that they wanted to include it in their museum. And we're really thankful for that message of, healing and reconciliation to be there. Because in China, there's a lot of movies, a lot of TV series on this issue, but there's no solution that's being offered. And oops, sorry, this is, that's the statue of Pak Young-shim. She was in the photo, the first photo that I showed you, the pregnant woman. Pak Young-shim was actually the one who verified that this group of 6 buildings was the comfort station that she was enslaved in Nanjing. And she's from North Korea, and she was able to travel in her 70s all the way to Nanjing, and then she went to Myanmar, to the other comfort station. it was part of her pilgrimage and bringing closure. I have a thin book of North Korean survivor stories. I can give it to you, Helen, for the task force if you want. But this man, he's a government official, and his heart is so amazing. We both wept, for the women, because everything we do, it has to be all about the women, and to remember them, to honor them, to bring them healing. And Chen is his name. I just really honor him. I really love his heart and his work. And the man in the middle is an adopted son of a comfort woman survivor. And here we are, this is the wall of suffering. When you first come into this museum, the same people who produced and managed the Rape of Nanjing Museum, they were the ones to also manage and set up the Comfort Woman Japanese Military Sex Slavery Museum. So it's important to commemorate these women, as a monument to peace, as a monument to never again. Let's never again allow this to happen on our watch. Also, one important note, these women mostly do not like to be called comfort women because it's such a loaded, derogatory term. I use it because the public can recognize it. That's the only reason why I use it. But if I were to be speaking to survivors, I would never use that term. And so my book, it took me about 10 years to collect interviews because I was still working as a journalist, and really wanted to give up this topic because it's just so depressing. It's so depressing. I just thought, why me, Lord? I just don't want to do this. But I think it's a calling. It's a calling. It was a choice I had to make. I can live a comfortable life, and I could have, because I like fashion and I like dining, fine dining, and but as a professional, as a privileged woman, and the reason why I wept with Chen at the Chinese Nanjing Museum was here I was as a privileged woman. I could fly in here. And I could fly out. But these women from all over Asia, Koreans, Taiwanese, Chinese, Myanmar, Malaysians, East Timorese, Indonesians, they were dragged by ship, sometimes train, by force. And so I felt compelled, I was challenged to give up the white picket fence. Me and my husband, we don't want the white picket fence lifestyle. We want to stand for the voiceless. So that's what I do. I train people in Hong Kong on how to speak on comfort women. I campaigned in universities and schools, trying to get other people to do things. One Korean national, a young girl who is an art history major, is setting up an art exhibit in Hong Kong on this topic with artists from Korea. It's really important to have films. One filmmaker, I said, take my book, you can use whatever stories. Please inject a reconciliation theme, please. And let's have that, with this issue. Just like Elie Wiesel was able to, encourage the flourishing of magazine articles, books, films, TV series. I dream of seeing that with this issue. So that we will never forget what happened to the most vulnerable. These are the women from the poorest of the poor. In Taiwan, the Japanese preyed on the Aboriginal marginalized community, right? So yeah, that's the dream. And so what's still needed? A sincere apology to allow the wounds from over 70 years ago to heal once and for all. And we dream of, myself, my husband, a former MP from Holland, and some other people who are involved politically and human rights experts, we're dreaming of a healing conference led by survivors. What if it's at, the President Jimmy Carter Center, and we bring in people like President Jimmy Carter, Desmond Tutu, statesmen and women who can bring the Japanese government to the table. And the point is not to shame them, not to make them feel any guilt, because we want them to be able to issue an apology that's sincere and that's not forced. But what if we were able to do this before the dwindling number of survivors die? What if? What if it's in Atlanta? I mean, someone said, oh, let's have it in The Hague. But what if, it's here because of, Jimmy Carter and the legacy of Martin Luther King, and I don't know, I'm just throwing it out to you, and we're open. And let's stop the cycle of sex slavery. In China, there are many North Korean women who are forced into cyber pornography or sold as brides. And I've interviewed several of them. And it is one of the most depressing stories I've ever heard. And there are so many courageous missionaries who are risking their lives in the Underground Railroad to, help these women. But what about America, right? We need to stop the cycle of sex slavery here. Atlanta is one of the largest hubs for human trafficking in America. And the world is helping so few of them, less than 0.1%, right? How can that be? We've got the most cutting edge technology, there's so many professionals, so many, do-gooders and altruistic people. A lot of millennials want to help, Why? And so a few years ago, I started a nonprofit that was out of my church called the 852 Freedom Campaign. 852 is the area code for Hong Kong. And I, with my husband, we mobilized over 20,000 people in over 55 events to do something, to initiate projects, to initiate fundraising. We supported them, and it was about mobilizing ordinary people and, to fight human trafficking, to fight or advocate for the Japanese military sex slavery survivors. And it's our dream to, see America step up, to see people, all over the world. And, what a timely issue to galvanize around the historical military sex slavery. If we can, tap into this so that it doesn't just end with this issue, but we fight for, we help the Korean women and the Chinese women and the Vietnamese women who are being trafficked into the United States, or even, Americans and Canadians who are being trafficked out as well to Asia. There are many boys actually trafficked to the Middle East because they want to, they prefer boys in the Middle East. So thank you for your time. Really was an honor. And if you have any questions, I don't know if there's time for Q&A, but I can stay around with Ross if you have any questions. Really want to honor Helen Kim Ho and the task force for what you're doing. It's history making, really, and you won't regret anything you've done. Because every bit counts, and I'm just hoping that there will be a change of heart with the Civil Rights Museum, that they'll recognize that this issue, that the women, it's about the women, and not to cave in to any kind of pressure or intimidation tactic from the government. Thank you.